Hey there, if you like this kind of content on my channel and also understand German, I did a video with my man Kijoschi on his channel Spielleiterwillkür. We talk about like communication at the gaming table. It was really a lot of fun to have that talk with him. I'll put the link in the doobly-doo. Welcome back to system agnostic classes. As per usual, these classes are system agnostic. Words are just words, and if you like to use different words or other things for the same words, that's fine. And leave your historical preconceptions at the door. These are primarily designed for play in secondary worlds, although today we do have a little bit of historical context to understand what kind of stuff these classes represent. But I mean, you can do like Victorian Gothic in a lot of worlds. And also, we're gonna try to do some like subversion at the end of all this, so stay tuned. Let's be honest, this is the first character archetype that we think about if we want a hero for our Victorian mystery story. It's really the prototype of the 1920s noir detective type character, although today when we write Victorian stories, it's really that we just take the noir detective from the 1920s and put him in the Victorian age because of all the tropes that it has accumulated and other tropes that it has shed. Although the main difference seems to be that there's more syphilis and like less alcoholism. And also maybe they're a little less cynical in the Victorian age. But the fact of the matter is that the Investigator is really a good character that can fit into any setting and or time period. Although, when we actually see them played, usually they're like middle-aged men who are good at brawling and highly intelligent and have a bit of an antisocial streak. Jeez, I wonder which defining literary icon that could come from. Nowadays, the Sherlock Holmesiness of it all is often replaced with like the grizzled cop aesthetic, which is the Sherlock Holmesiness just reenacted in a more cynical age, and I like playing this kind of character a lot. I really enjoy the archetype, just unironically. I don't care how played out it is. Last week, I made a character like this. And for the amount of liking that people claim to have for the mystery genre in all kinds of really settings as an adventure, it's, I feel, an underutilized skill set in player characters. You know, being able to put together clues, investigate like a crime scene, interrogate suspects, shadow people, gather intelligence. Unless you're playing a system that is specifically focused around this kind of character, not really the staple of your average D&D party. And I think that part of the reason for this is that much of the fun that we derive from mystery adventures is basically metagaming. It's the players figuring out the mystery and getting the satisfaction from it and pretending that the characters are doing it, as opposed to like more combat-focused missions where it's the characters that do most of the heavy lifting. Like, I will be able to make the executive decision to send the paladin from here to there, but they are still the one who knows how to swing the sword good. And the kind of scene where the skill set is required, it is often like the offhand skill set of some other character, usually the rogue, when it's about like looking at this specific crime scene or finding that particular hidden compartment. Plus, the Investigator is fundamentally a very urban character. You rarely will find them out in the village somewhere where they, I don't know, might work for an inquisitor, I suppose. But most of play kind of happens in the wilderness in most RPGs most of the time, and there much of the role that the Investigator fills is filled by the Ranger. I mean, think about it, right? They look at the sites of where things happened and then determine what happened, what the tracks are, what killed what in which sequence, and where it went, and in the end it just turns out it's a were-crocodile as opposed to a serial killer, but it's really much the same thing. They also both tend to be quite useful in a combat situation. So even though it is a really interesting character archetype that it is always cool to have at the table, unless you're playing a specific Victorian or 1920s setting, usually it kind of falls through the cracks. And of course, part of the reason for that might be that they are always played the same. I would like to see a sociable extrovert as a kind of character, or just even like a woman. You have the middle-aged, grizzled cop person, but they're a woman. And you have the, you know, the changes that come from that. That already would be quite interesting. And no, I will not lead by example on this. So back in the Victorian era, and I use this term loosely because it happened like not just strictly in what scholars might define the Victorian era to be, there were people who made a living by stealing corpses. Now why? How was this a market? Well, simply because back then, if you wanted to train doctors or like practice medical science, find out things about the human body, you needed to cut open corpses, otherwise you couldn't do it. That was the only way of looking inside a person. But because of the taboos of the time, like in many jurisdictions you couldn't even donate your body to science, which wasn't even a concept back then really, if you wanted to. Young medical science had a ravenous appetite for human bodies, but the only ones that they got were the bodies of like severe criminals that got executed, like murderers and rapists. And it turns out there's actually not that many of those. This is why they had people go to graveyards and dig up the corpses of the recently deceased for money. This went so far that a lot of graveyards had like beefed up security to make sure that nobody would steal bodies. And after a few days, well, the corpse was too rotted to be useful for most of the science anyway. In role-playing games, I have often found that grave robbery is something that's quite common even outside of its historical pseudo-season. Sometimes you have to open a grave to stake the vampire, or to get parts for the necromancing flesh stitcher who just needs parts. And frankly, if you loot skeletons in Skyrim, you know, the kind that are already dead when you find them, you're kind of a grave robber also? I mean, fuck, if you think about it, a lot of adventures, the premise of them is that you have your people and you go inside of an old tomb and you get loot that is there. But let's work off the archetype of the Victorian age grave robber and try to give him some useful skills. Obviously, they'd be good at sneaking and smuggling things through the city. They'd probably be quite good at having underground contacts, and if it's a common problem, they'd know a thing or two about the undead. And we can cut out the middleman and just also make them medical professionals, so they would also have the skill set of a mundane healer, or maybe they are just straight up necromancers. So then you'd essentially have a mixture between a rogue and a healer, and maybe they fight with a shovel, so you'd also have Shovel Knight, I guess. Plus, they, in the context of spelunking into ancient graves, would be very useful to any adventuring party. Because, let's be honest, a lot of the archaeologists of that era, kind of grave robbers, but glorified. I mean, true, there is some nuance in that they often didn't just sell what they found, and the countries where they found those things hardly had the right infrastructure to properly, you know, conserve and evaluate and do the archaeological science with the things that they found, but kind of technically it's still grave robbery. Also often referred to as mediums, psychics occupy a very interesting niche that doesn't always work in a lot of settings. So for the background of how this archetype developed, the Victorian age was big on like the Enlightenment and science. All of that stuff was, the technology was replacing many of the spiritual aspects and beliefs that people had. But those were still very prevalent, and the world was still mysterious enough for magic to be believable. There were still unexplored spots on the map, places unknown to the people who didn't happen to live there. The world was quite large, and also like a proper scientific methodology hadn't developed yet to the extent that we have it today. So a lot of pseudoscience went hand in hand with actual proper science. You know, you might have heard about the whole phrenology thing, where they went with the assumption that black people are inferior to white people, and then they just took whatever evidence they could find that they could interpret in a way that would support their case. That kind of stuff. And the reason that was even possible was because while science was coming out with new answers to new questions every day, just every answer led to a whole bunch new questions. And this is normal for us today, but back then that was a novel thing, just always more questions, while at the same time there were people who knew what was going on. So, you know, you could just come along and claim to be an expert on something, and you would have this air of legitimacy around you because other people have found out things. Enter psychics. Now, a lot of the psychic stuff was just folklore repackaged into a more modern, at the time, setting, but also it was a lot of just science that was made up to sound like it made sense. And the nice thing about role-playing games is that it can make sense, because we have magic. The psychic is really kind of a charismatic, maybe even a little flamboyant scholar of strange things, with a little bit of the investigator in it, just with the focus being on the incorporeal, which I think is a cool way of splitting up these three classes, where the investigator is focused on like the social horror aspect. The grave robber is focused on the corporeal horror aspect, you know, the like body horror and stuff, and the psychic being more focused on the spectral, ghostly horror. They might be able to like identify certain kinds of ectoplasm, what they mean, or like just commune with dead spirits to find answers to questions, which can be very useful in a murder investigation. Now, of course, you might get to the point where oh, there's a dead guy. Who killed him? Well, the fucking psychic rolled a 20, and now he just talks to him. It was the butler. And then the adventure is done. This huge thing that you had planned, they know it's the butler. I personally, in that specific situation, would just make them find the hard evidence to prove it. But that might not be something that your setting allows if, for instance, psychics are just people who are believed categorically. Which is why I like to keep these things, you know, also like predictive powers, precognition, all that kind of stuff, auguring. I like to keep that vague as a player ability, also because it's difficult when you have players at the table who can sometimes be a bit, you know, what are they gonna do? I don't know, you can't really make any predictions. I like to keep that vague, and if you want to make the psychic feel more useful, because that maybe feels to you like it wasn't useful enough, give them some alchemy skills. Maybe they can like summon or talk to demons, maybe some mild telepathy, that would be cool. Some very interesting stories can be generated this way. But now, how are we going to subvert all this? We live in an age that is not dissimilar to the Victorian age in many key regards. This like blending of science and folklore spiritualism is something that in the hyper-rationalist Western world exists only at the fringes of society, but in many other countries is very much just a common thing. Like in Thailand, for instance, people just believe in ghosts. They also believe in science. They go to the medical doctor, they get degrees in chemistry and stuff, but ghosts are just a thing that exists. Obviously, hashtag not all of them. I shouldn't have to say this, but there's gonna be some idiot in the comments. Obviously, the Investigator is a very easy thing to transport into a current setting because, I mean, it exists. It's called the grizzled cop detective Jimmy McNulty type character. It's very common. You have it on almost all crime television shows. Grave robbers are a little more difficult. In the age of CAT scans and you just having complete models in medical school, and there also not really being much of a shortage of bodies anymore, except for donor organs, but I don't think you really want to play a character that steals organs from people. There isn't really that much of a huge demand for stealing bodies from graveyards anymore. But if we do add like necromancy and alchemy, there might actually be need for scavenged bodies. Psychics are a bit of a joke in the modern world. In the Victorian age, they were more respected even in circles of high society, sometimes even circles of high education, as purveyors of mystical knowledge. That isn't really the case anymore that much. But in a world where magic is real, they absolutely could be. We might actually give them a more scientific bend. Maybe they wear lab coats instead of like fancy dresses and suits. Maybe they take the, you know, they get like a thing and they put the ectoplasm in it, they look at it under a microscope, and they have machines with Ouija boards and all that. You run it in a way that is more scientific and rationalistic, because in this universe, it is not pseudoscience, but actual science. Or really, you could have both if you wanted to. Thank you very much for watching this episode of System Agnostic Classes. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. Maybe buy some of this merchandise that is now underneath the videos, or buying my short story collection, 34 Worlds. And in that spirit, maybe like twist the tropes a little bit. Maybe combine all these three. Maybe play an investigator. Or if you want, just play the archetypal investigator. I don't care. Play whatever makes you happy. And see you around, cunts.